If, Andrew, perhaps starting with you, Efic. The FTAs that have been announced, negotiated, the TPP that was spoken about. In my introductory comments, I suggested that these would be good for Australia, but I also suggested perhaps there had been some criticism raised about them around secrecy provisions in terms of the negotiation, perhaps overplaying the outcome. But from your perspective and what you see, and particularly with respect to the small business community, how do you think the FTAs are going to work for Australia's benefit, and perhaps some of the dimension associated with that?
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Firstly, I think the FTAs come at a very good time for Australia. So since 2011, our terms of trade have fallen roughly 30%. There's been a slump in global commodity prices. But the good news that's come out of all of that is our exchange rate is now materially lower than it was in 2011. So relative to when it was at parity to the US dollar back in 2011, now it's 70 cents. That's creating a whole bunch of new export opportunities for Australia's exporters, particularly small business exporters. So I think one of the great things that comes out of free trade agreements is they are enablers of trade. So free trade agreements in their own right don't actually make trade happen, but what they do is they enable trade to happen because they break down barriers and they provide market access that previously wasn't available to Australian businesses. At Efic, we very much have a focus on supporting small businesses in their export endeavours. And what I can share with you about an exporter is, firstly, exporters, and particularly small business exporters, are amongst Australia's best companies, because you would hope that if you can't achieve success domestically, we don't want to see you going overseas. So what happens is small businesses that have achieved success domestically tend to go overseas. So they're creative, they're confident, they're optimistic. They are amongst Australia's best companies. And what we find with these companies is they like to see a signal that a particular market could well be attractive. So to share with you one example, even though CHAFTA hasn't actually been signed yet, we saw a small business in South Australia called Limestone Coast Wines that said, if I look ahead 10 years, I can see that the Korean market and the Chinese market are going to be huge opportunities for me. So they went off, pioneering, went to Korea, went to China and secured export contracts, not because of the benefits they're going to get today, but because of the benefits that they can see flowing in the future. What we're seeing amongst small businesses is the advent of the free trade agreements, the fact that more technology is enabling export, it's breaking down those barriers of distance, is encouraging more and more of our domestic companies to become exporters. And perhaps, Stephen, if I can just share two examples of the way a lot of Australian small businesses are actually doing business today. One of them is called Cherry Blooms. The other company is called Studio Agency. They're based in Brisbane. And both of these companies, again, they see benefits flowing from the FTAs, but these companies are basically ideas in a box. So Cherry Blooms are manufacturers of artificial eyelashes, of all things. And the woman who runs that business, an incredible entrepreneur, she said to me, Andrew, everyone needs good lashes. She was a fantastic woman that we had at this lunch. Now, they do not manufacture anything in Australia. So what are they exporting? Well, they're exporting their intellectual property, their ideas, the distribution networks that they've been able to create, the way that they can actually get their product to the end market. So they're using global supply chains to manufacture their product in Korea. Studio Agency manufactures, it's a fashion label, manufactures its product in China. Again, product never comes to Australia, but they are an Australian exporter. And certainly commerce, e-commerce, and the way that the new standardised rules that I think under the free trade agreements will enable more and more small businesses to have the courage to step out of the domestic market and go into these international markets. So in summary, Stephen, the FTAs in their own right aren't the success. What they do is they break down the barriers and they are enablers for our small businesses.
And those lashes come in 50 shades of grey, one would ask. If I could perhaps turn to Tracey. Tracey, the issue around technology breaking down barriers and the role that e-commerce plays, from your experience, how important is that going to be, and do the FTAs and the current trade arrangements with Australia, will they get greater benefit from that?
So I guess I'll answer the question a couple of ways. Certainly I think e-commerce is, when you look at where businesses are growing and when you look at the world we live in, e-commerce is the thing that breaks down whatever country you're in. If you can't find something in Australia, you find it overseas. If you don't like the price of what it is here, you arbitrage it naturally overseas, because that's what we've all been able to do with the internet. Our business is entirely an IP business. It's entirely human capital based. So I think, you know, for the promise of the FTA is that it enables those barriers that create fences around countries to come down. From a point of view of an Australian company, I think the biggest advantage one of the biggest challenges we face is the access to skills. In a business that's human capital, the biggest thing that inhibits and actually has the potential to limit the growth, unless you find other solutions for the problem, is access to the skilled resources that you need. So our business is entirely human capital. It's people in Melbourne, hundreds of them in Church Street, who are building the site and the mobile apps and the capability that are realestate.com.au. And we are almost tapped out in being able to find the skills and resources that we need. So we look offshore for other people to resource that. So anything that helps mobility of people who are going to Peter Dawkins School and being able to stay in the country and work for us, anything that helps us bring in people, whether it's temporarily or permanently, because what that does is help build our product, and that's the product that we take to Australia, and increasingly now as we're in other countries, and hopefully in 5 more countries if the plan we announced last week comes through.
I mean, it does raise the issue, does it not, as certainly we did in our report, about the free movement of skilled people between economies. And we talked about Australia, New Zealand, or we've made a suggestion about Australia, Singapore perhaps being the next trialist. And if this works, then a government policy could evolve around that. From what you're saying, the simple fact is that having skills available becomes critical to the businesses in which you've been involved in and those that you represent are involved
Correct.
in, and therefore we need to ensure that those sorts of skills are available.
Absolutely.
Okay. Peter, Australia has not Peter, this Peter next to me. Australia over a long period of time, and indeed I think a cursory reading of any of the agreements with the free trade agreement regime that's been put in place with our trading partners, has very much been a dependent one on agriculture, primary resources, resources more generally. Given, however, as we know, 80% of Australians are employed in the services economy, given, as we've said, that small businesses are important but not embracing at the moment, it would appear, internationalisation and global supply chains, what do you think that means in terms of Australia's current economic base and dependence on things like agriculture, etc.? Are we going to get bigger bangs for our bucks out of the free trade agreement regime that have been put in place around those sorts of industries?
Thanks, Stephen. Look, it's a great question because it's clearly agri has been front and centre in the marketing and the coverage and the newsworthiness of both the 3 free trade agreements and the TPP as they've been signed. So let me put a bit of perspective around. Let me give you 2 reasons to get excited about agri and 2 reasons that are, I guess, are notes of caution. Look, there is reason to be excited, and agri is a big winner from the FTAs and the FTA with China in particular. The signing of these FTAs have come at a time when the growing middle class in China in particular is starting to have a genuine impact on global demand and consumption patterns. Andrew mentioned the work they've done for a small South Australian winemaker, and wine's a perfect example. As a point of reference, in 2013, China overtook firstly Italy and then France as the largest consumer of red wine in the world, having seen 150% growth over a 5-year period. So China now consumes about 1.9 billion bottles of red wine a year versus about 1.8 billion in France and 1.7 billion in Italy. The reason to get excited about that is that equates to about 1.5 bottles per capita per annum in China versus 27 bottles per capita per annum in France and Italy. Now, no one's suggesting for a moment that the Chinese are going to develop those famous French and Italian consumption habits. But by the same token, even if Chinese consumption was only to get to 10% of the level that it is in Europe, that's a doubling of demand in what is already the world's largest market. That's the sort of scope that the population base and the middle class in China bring to this debate. The changing consumption patterns also favour those industries where Australia has a real competitive advantage. So it's about wine, it's about beef and frozen meat, live cattle, it's about dairy in particular, and value-added dairy products. So all of that is terrific and very, very positive. The second reason to get excited is that exactly those categories, the high value-add categories where Australia has a competitive advantage, are where the high tariffs currently are. So tariffs on wine, on beef, on dairy, range up to the sort of 20 to 25% level today. So the impact of the reduction in those tariffs down to zero over the next few years is significant. And again, I'll give you a point of reference, and this is something that Andrew Robb has brought out in his article in the document, which I'd strongly commend to you. It's a terrific insight. Post the signing of the free trade agreements with both Korea and Japan, where frozen beef was subject to very, very high tariffs in the sort of 30 to 40% range. Just since those FTAs have been signed, we've seen 50% growth in the export of frozen beef to Korea and 30% growth in the export of frozen beef to Japan. So that's a sense, I guess, of the sort of the sort of impact you can see when those high tariffs start to fall on particular categories. And I guess the final positive point I'd make is to look at the experience in New Zealand. So New Zealand, as many of you would be aware, signed a free trade agreement with China in 2008. And since 2008, New Zealand dairy exports to China have increased 8-fold, and New Zealand beef exports to China have increased 11-fold. So that's an indication of the sort of scale of benefit. Now, 2 words of caution, and the first is I guess, to build on that New Zealand experience, and also to build on Andrew's comments about free trade agreements. I think you said they don't make trade happen, but they make trade possible. And I think it would be a disservice to say that the growth in the New Zealand dairy industry in particular has purely been as a result of the free trade agreements. It was a result of a very, very coordinated, smart, well-executed strategy by both the private sector and government to build that market. And I also think it's worth noting that they benefited enormously from having a dominant player in Fonterra in New Zealand. And again, for those unaware, Fonterra accounts for about 93%, I think, of New Zealand's dairy processing. So by definition, you had an industry speaking with one voice, and that's been one of the challenges here historically, where we have a far more diversified, disparate supplier base. The largest processor in Australia accounts for less than a third of total dairy volumes, and I think just getting the industry to speak with one voice is a huge step forward, and something I think, I was talking to Stephen before, organisations like CEDA potentially have a significant role to play in. The second and final point I'd make is just to put agri in context. Australia's agricultural exports to China make up about 8% of our total exports to China, absolutely dwarfed by, for example, coal, iron ore, and other energy and hard commodities. Of that 8%, only about 20% of it is in the categories that I've talked about, where the real opportunities are in wine, in dairy, in beef. The bulk of the rest is in wool, where there's no change in tariffs, although there is potentially some change in the quotas, and grains and oilseeds where there's no change. So If you do the maths all the way through, you know, those exciting agri-commodities I've talked about account for about 2% of Australia's current exports to China, so it's worth keeping that in context too. So positive, very, very positive. Certainly deserves, you know, the publicity it's getting, the opportunities there, but it does need to be seen in context.
Thank you, Peter. Professor Dawkins, one of the chapters that we have included in our document, in our research publication, goes to the significance and the importance of Australia's education alumni. Those that are attracted to come to Australia to get a cutting-edge, excellent education, and the fact that these folks then return home to take significant roles in their own home countries. From your perspective, running a university which, as I said in my introduction to you, has an overwhelming number of international students on an annual basis coming here for that education, where do you see FTAs providing you with an additional uplift, and the whole question around alumni and the contribution that they make, how significant is that going to be in terms of perhaps future economic opportunities for Australia?
So I think alumni are a huge asset to Australia. We've got 2.5 million foreign alumni in countries outside of Australia. And the chapter in the book refers to them as hidden ambassadors. Actually, I don't think they're that hidden. So they've already played a very big role in promoting Australia as a destination for students, in being role models and being mentors. From Victoria University's point of view, I might just give you a couple of examples of two of our outstanding alumni, one of whom, Jeffrey Cheer from Malaysia, who is chair of the Someway Group, property group that diversified into education. There's a Someway Education Group, and we have a partnership with Someway where many of our students can study in Malaysia and then come to Victoria University after that. And he got that business going and developed a partnership with us. So the fact that he was an alumnus of us has helped us, and also has helped get more students coming from Malaysia. He's also worked with another of he's an alumnus of Monash University, and Monash University have a campus at Someway as well. And so that's just one example of the role that alumni can play. I think, having said that, we probably are at a stage now where we have to be more systematic about it, and where there are some policies that can be followed by universities, by government, working together that can further leverage the value of these alumni. I think one of them is that that students that come to Australia are really looking to get an Australian qualification because they think it's going to be helpful for their future careers. And now there's very large numbers of students going offshore, and then when they come back to their home country, as many of them do, they're one of huge numbers of returning alumni, and they've got to perhaps restart building their networks that are going to help them be successful in their countries. And we do have alumni chapters, and I was talking to John Richardson earlier about what the embassies do in the different countries, and they help support the various alumni. But we probably need to work more closely between DFAT, universities, getting together so that we don't all just run our individual chapters, that we work together and really create very strong networks for these students when they return. One of our other alumni actually is the chair of the Australia-China Chamber of Commerce in South China, and he's chair of the Alumni Association for Australian Students, Kevin Lee, a successful businessman, and I've been talking to him about this. He helps with our alumni, but he is keen to provide a facility across all universities returning to South China. I think that we need to be more systematic across all of the countries that we have students from, between DFAT, between the universities and these alumni associations. I think Tracey's made a point also earlier about industry and universities working together. It's quite a topical subject. Malcolm Turnbull's been talking quite a lot about that over the last week or two, and he had an interchange with the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne about why aren't universities in Australia, at a conference this was last week, more closely involved with industry compared to some other countries that seem to have taken it to a higher level. And there are various reasons for this, one of which Malcolm Turnbull was saying it's because academics aren't focused enough on industry. They're more interested in their academic achievements. But it's also, I think, something to do with the structure of the economy, and that small business is bigger in Australia than it is in some of the countries we're comparing ourselves with. And so we've got a lot of work to do, I think, to foster stronger linkages between industry and universities. And that's just from the point of view of the Australian economy. But if you think about the Asian century and the Asian economies, if we really are going to get value out of our alumni, and if we are really going to create great opportunities for students coming to Australia for their careers, then not only do we need to be working closely between universities and industries in Australia, we need to have sort of relationships back into Asia with industry partnerships, and we need to be offering students coming from Asian countries internship opportunities, entrepreneurial opportunities while they're here, and then when they return to their home countries, to have mentors and collaborators who help them, whether it be getting their businesses going or finding their employment opportunities. So there's just a few examples. I think as far as the actual free trade agreements are concerned, they create opportunities for Australia. In the education sector, the changes that are probably needed in some countries relate to the ease of access in operating offshore. There have been some minor changes, I think, in the free trade agreements that have assisted that, but they tend to be big issues in their own right. So in India, for example, at the moment, I heard recently of a university from Britain who actually built a university in India and then found they couldn't run it because they ran up against the local regulations. So there needs to be a lot of work on improving the regulatory environment in various countries that enable universities to operate and vocational education institutions to operate in those countries. And that's, again, something that our alumni can help us with, because quite a lot of our alumni are in important places in government in these various countries, and we need to work with them to help create the right environments for our educational institutions to do these kinds of things.
Thank you, Peter. A question to the whole panel. One of the recommendations that we've made in our report suggests that 20 years between drinks in terms of developing a formal trade policy statement perhaps is a touch long. I wonder whether our panellists have a view, individually, collectively, as to the desirability of that, picking up on some of the points that have been made across the table. I mean, Peter Dawkins talked about the fact that India, for example, the world's biggest democracy, except it's a closed shop when it comes to higher education in many respects. When we look at the nature of agriculture in Australia and what the FTA might mean, yes, if you're a big player, but perhaps not if you're a small player. Difficulties in the small business sector, interrelationships around technology and connectivity, etc. So as a question then to the whole panel, and perhaps we might start at this end and go across, how important would be, from your perspective, having a trade policy statement that sets out the fundamental principles that both sides of politics could be happy with, to embrace and set some of the guidelines for future FTA negotiations? Peter, this end, Peter.
Oh, look, I think, you know, clearly that's, you know, that's nirvana, isn't it, at the end of the day? You know, to have a consistent framework across jurisdictions and a consistent approach applied. I think I read in the document somewhere there are currently 276 different versions of free trade agreements around the place. As an interesting aside, none of the major ones include Africa, which is an interesting discussion for another time. Look, when we talk to when we talk to our customers about establishing export businesses, we talk to them about needing to get three things right. You know, one is to have your supply chains in place, your go-to-market model, your ability to actually get your product to your customers, and that's around you know, local partners and having established networks in place. The second, and you'd expect us to say this, is about having the right flexible financing in place to be able to manage your working capital and your inventories in particular. But the third is actually understanding the risks and understanding and managing the risks of an export business relative to a domestic business. And yeah, in some cases those risks are obvious and easy to manage: currency risk and interest rate risk and the hedging strategies around those. But the risks that are tougher to manage are the fact that you're doing business in multiple jurisdictions, you're subject to a different level of sovereign risk, you're subject to a different regulatory regime, you're subject to a different set of rules in every individual market you're operating in, regardless of whether there's a free trade agreement in place or not. And that to me remains the big challenge, that as someone looking to establish an export business, you've got to view every single potential customer jurisdiction as a completely separate new set of rules and a new frontier, and to the extent there can be a consistent set of principles around that govern how all of these free trade agreements that Australia's party to operate, that would be a huge step forward.
Andrew.
To give a perspective on small business, I think that would be helpful, but I don't think it would be critical. So to share with you one example, the signing of the free trade agreements potentially gives Australian exporters and small businesses in particular greater access to the emerging middle class in those countries, but China in particular. So you look at China, its middle class is estimated to grow somewhere around 400 million people between 2012 and 2022. That's a huge opportunity for Australia's small business exporters. The live cattle agreement that's recently been signed suggests that Australia could export an additional 1 million head of cattle worth somewhere between $1 and $2 billion. That's a 75% increase on where we are today. So who forms the Australian agricultural exporters? Well, firstly, in the agricultural space, 98% of the companies that participate in agriculture are small to medium-sized enterprises, and 90% of agricultural exporters are small to medium enterprises. So you can see that those agreements open up an enormous market for Australia. So the small business owner says, fantastic, I've got the confidence to invest now because the demand side looks promising. So what's the biggest challenge in capturing that additional 1 million head of cattle? When we talk to small businesses, they say the biggest challenges now are actually on the supply side. So I ask them, okay, well, where are the challenges? They say, well, infrastructure. It's infrastructure in Australia, and it's also the infrastructure in the importing country. It's transport logistics. How do I get my product efficiently from the farm to the table in the Chinese market? So I think for a small business owner, having these sorts of principles are helpful and they are important. But I think if Australia is going to be successful in capturing that demand that now looks like it has been freed up, I think we do have some challenges that we need to address domestically around transport, around logistics, around infrastructure, and also around e-commerce.
Tracey, from your perspective, the idea of having a trade statement that gives some confidence, particularly in Australia, that governments know what they're doing and know what they're talking about more precisely as they go into those negotiations?
So I think helpful but not sufficient, perhaps, a bit like what Andrew said before. I mean, we have an easy, if I look at my own business, the role of our logistics is far simpler. We don't ship or move anything. We create it once and we share it with millions of consumers in Australia and in other countries. And so, for us, it's about how we take that IP and that knowledge and we bring it to other countries. And so, I think the thing around whether it's the TPP or the China Free Trade or the Korean one. Each of those create and present new opportunities because inherently they're reducing barriers. At the same time, you need to have the rule of law in each of those countries, and a free trade in and of itself can somehow replace, as the document lays out, replace or create another onus or level of responsibility on the rule of law. For us, the biggest thing that inhibits our growth is skills. And if we can't get the skills here in Australia sufficient, we'll go to other places and we'll do it there. If we could bring the skills in, that's great. Otherwise, we'll find other solutions to that problem. And I'm not sure that an overarching nirvana view of all trade will necessarily take that problem and go away.
Professor Dawkins.
Well, I think there are two concepts being discussed here, aren't there? One is the principles of trade policy, which is to guide government, and the other is the principles of doing good business, doing good international business, which is a different topic. They're obviously interrelated. Look, it sounds like a good idea to me to have a trade statement. I wouldn't like to have to write it, though, I must admit. I mean, we all support free trade. That's easy. Tick. And we all believe in multilateral free trade agreements and everybody cutting tariff barriers and so on. When it comes to bilateral trade agreements, and it gets much more murky, and I think there's a very good chapter in the book by one of my professors, actually, Peter Dixon, about all of this, which says, on balance, and Maureen Rimmer, I should mention Maureen as well. On balance, you know, these agreements have done good, but there's costs and benefits. I mean, having a go at trying to write the principles that govern that, I think, would be useful and a good guide to negotiators. At the end of the day, these negotiations, though, do get down into some quite murky details, and I guess you probably don't want to tie their hands completely with things, too much detail in policy statements that would tie them up. But I think this other topic that's being raised here about business strategy to be successful in export markets, and for example, the logistics and supply chain industry, is a huge opportunity, I think, for Australia, and it's one that I've taken interest in because it's a sector that we run courses for and do research on, and we're working together with industry. We're trying to set up a centre of excellence in supply chain logistics, getting all the industry players together in Australia, linking them with offshore players, I think, and developing some sort of strategic agendas in industry sectors like that. And skills is a very important aspect of that. Where do we need the skills? How do we need to invest in them? But that's sort of going a bit beyond, of course, the trade policy statement.
Okay, I have 2 yes, 2 no, roughly, and which is great. That's CEDA, you know, down the middle, different points of view. One of the things, of course, that I alluded to in my introductory comments was around perhaps the tendency for trade statements, whether they be a genuine trade statement of, say, 20 years ago or something that might be contemplated now. And by the way, Peter, if you're looking for someone to write it, CEDA puts its hand up. We'll take that independent view. My people have just gone berserk. But anyway, we could do that. But the other issue for me was the potential and the tendency for something being dressed up as a trade statement, in fact, to be more a security statement or a foreign affairs policy statement. And I note that there'd been some criticism, particularly around the TPP as being viewed as such, where you've got 12 countries signed up, but you don't have China. And I think that's an issue which also could be perhaps drawn to people's attention as we start to think through what a trade policy statement might actually look like.